A black woman boards her routine flight home after a long work week, just another face in the crowd. But when she calmly raises a simple safety concern, the flight attendant rolls her eyes, dismisses her, and humiliates her in front of everyone. What the crew doesn't know: she's actually a high-ranking Federal Aviation Regulator conducting an undercover inspection. Within minutes, everything spirals, and the fallout? It shakes the entire airline industry. What happens next exposes the hidden power of everyday bias and the courage it takes to stand alone. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from today? And if you believe these stories matter, like, share, and subscribe for more. It started as just another flight, until it wasn't. There is a particular kind of silence that falls on a woman just before the world tries to define her. It is not the hush of peace, nor the stillness of rest. It is the silence that precedes a storm, the silence of being measured by the gaze of others long before you've opened your mouth. When Celeste Braxton boarded that early morning flight from Dallas to New York, she wasn't anyone's story yet. She wasn't history or resistance or proof of a nation's contradictions. She was simply a woman, tired, competent, and unremarkably black. Dressed in a modest blazer and flats, hair neatly pulled back, eyes steady, and bones weary from years of making herself small in rooms that never knew how to hold her largeness. Celeste had spent the last 3 days buried in the bureaucratic trenches of an FAA safety summit, gray halls, coffee gone cold, and people who nodded at her credentials but not her existence. She was no stranger to it. She had walked the halls of power, drafted policy, even once revised the very emergency protocols that flight attendants now parroted at 30,000 feet. But this morning, she was just a passenger. A body in a seat, a number on a manifest. The airport, like every other institution in America, was not immune to history. Its floors gleamed, its gates barked numbers through overhead speakers, and its staff, well, they moved with the same calculated blindness found in most systems built to serve the many while fearing the few. And Celeste, to them, was one of the few. One of those passengers who might complain. Who might ask too many questions. Who might insist on being treated as if her concerns mattered. The gate agent didn't look up when Celeste approached. He barely scanned her ID, waving her forward with emotion that felt more like dismissal than approval. Celeste felt it, not in her body, not in her skin, but in that space between breath and patience where black folks have always learned to carry their doubts. She said nothing, just smiled the way her mother taught her, tight-lipped, chin high, spine straight. A smile that said, "I see you, even if you don't see me." The waiting area was full of the usual choreography: business travelers pecking at keyboards, young lovers whispering promises, children too loud for the hour. Celeste found a seat near the gate and pulled out her notebook. Her mind was still half in the conference room, still sorting through the latest statistics on non-compliance rates, still hearing the echo of a young white male supervisor saying, "I just don't think bias is really a factor anymore." Celeste didn't argue. She rarely did in those spaces. She knew that sometimes the strongest argument is survival itself, showing up again and again, despite being erased. But today would be different. Today, history would find her on an airplane aisle, where safety met prejudice, where credentials met condescension, and where a woman who had spent her life making things safer would be told, once again, to sit down and stay in her place. She just didn't know it yet, because that's how these things begin. Not with sirens, or protests, or viral videos. They begin with the look. The tone. The moment when someone decides they know what you are before you open your mouth. Before you state your name. The flight hadn't even begun, but the air had already shifted. And in that shift, in that silent tremor, America's old story began again. But Celeste Braxton? She wasn't new to the story. She was just done letting it be told without her. The airplane, in all its modern trappings, remains one of the last places where hierarchy wears no disguise. Behind every smile, every uniform, every polite nod from a flight attendant or tight-lipped gate agent, there lies a machinery not just of aviation, but of assumption. That morning, Celeste Braxton found herself under it once again. Not crushed, not broken, but measured. And measured falsely. She boarded like anyone else, her boarding pass and a clean permission slipped through America's sky. The woman at the gate didn't say much, just scanned, nodded, and moved on to the next. But even that even silence has its temperature. Celeste had learned long ago to feel the chill behind a gesture meant to dismiss rather than welcome. She walked the narrow aisle with the grace of a woman who had long stopped apologizing for taking up space. As she reached row 7, seat C, she placed her bag overhead and settled in. The flight attendant at the front door barely acknowledged her. A quick glance, nothing more. But when the man 2 passengers behind her stepped on, a tall white executive in a tailored suit, she saw the difference. The smile came out. The welcome aboard, sir. They practiced warmth. Not cruel. Just habitual. Racism, Celeste thought, rarely screams these days. It whispers. It shrugs. The rows filled quickly. Celeste watched people settle in, adjust pillows, pull headphones out of bags. A child cried 2 rows ahead. A mother muttered apologies. A man grumbled about delays. Life in miniature. Then came the voice. "Ma'am, I need to speak with you for a second." It was the flight attendant, Angela, her name tag read, blonde, mid-30s, with the professional sharpness that made politeness feel like protocol rather than empathy. Celeste blinked. "Yes." Angela glanced at Celeste's carry-on overhead. "This bag, was it yours?" "Yes," Celeste said, calmly. "We've got to make room for a medical assist device. I'll have to check your bag." Celeste tilted her head slightly. "It's within size limits. I boarded in the correct group." "Why my bag?" Angela didn't flinch. "It's just the one that needs to go. We need space." Celeste looked around. The overhead above the white man behind her, half empty. The man was still standing, scrolling through his phone. "What about that one?" Celeste asked, gesturing calmly. Angela's eyes narrowed, just briefly, before turning to look. "We'll see what we can do," she said tightly, then disappeared without another word. Celeste didn't move. She didn't protest. But she felt it, that old flame of being made the exception again. Not the violent kind. The quiet one. The one that questions your legitimacy without saying your name. The one that asks you to move not because there's no other way, but because you're the easiest one to ask. Because you're used to being asked. By the time the plane taxied to the runway, Celeste had begun to write. She always brought a small notebook, not for her FAA work, but for herself. For the things that didn't fit in official reports. The tone of a voice. The tension in a smile. The things no regulation could quantify, but every Black woman could name. She scribbled. Bag moved without cause. Gate agent cold. Attendant warm to white man behind me, clipped with me. No eye contact. Assumptions at every step. Outside, the engines roared. The plane lifted. And still, Celeste felt the weight. 40 minutes into the flight, the turbulence began. Not dangerous. Just enough to rattle trays and nerves. Angela walked briskly down the aisle, checking seat belts. She passed a man who had fallen asleep with his tray still down. She paused, looked at him, and walked on. 2 rows later, she reached Celeste. Celeste's tray was locked, her belt fastened. She was fine. Angela stopped anyway. "Ma'am, are you buckled?" Celeste raised an eyebrow and gently tugged the edge of the strap as proof. Angela stared for a beat longer than necessary, nodded, and moved on. It was a dance Celeste knew well, being seen too much and not enough, being both invisible and targeted, all in the same breath. She thought of the generations of women before her, who flew without credentials, without backup, who endured not just scrutiny, but suspicion. And here she was, with credentials deep in her bag and respect sewn into every thread of her blazer, and still the same patterns returned. The plane leveled. The captain's voice came overhead, chipper and routine. Outside, the clouds gave way to blue sky. But inside, Celeste sat very still. It wasn't about the bag, or the belt, or the silence. It was about what they didn't see when they looked at her. Not a traveler. Not a professional. Not a woman with power. Just someone they could check. Someone they could question. Someone they could disregard. She closed her eyes, leaned her head back, and thought, they still don't see us. Not really. Not unless we make them. And before this flight landed, Celeste knew she just might have to. There is a way that certain people learn to smile, not as joy, not as welcome, but as a disguise. It is the smile of the steward, the clerk, the uniformed gatekeeper who believes they are simply doing their job when they are, in fact, performing an inheritance of looking through you while still seeing everything they think they need to know. Celeste Braxton had known that smile since childhood. And that morning, as the plane cut a smooth line across the sky, she saw it again. The flight attendant Angela returned, this time with the beverage cart, the smile affixed like armor. But when she reached Celeste's row, that smile faltered. You again, Angela said under her breath, not quite softly enough. She handed a cup of water to Celeste as if it were a burden. Celeste accepted it with quiet grace. Thank you. Angela didn't respond. She moved on, greeting the man across the aisle with a cheerful tone, offering extra peanuts and a napkin. A different smile. A different truth. It wasn't about the drink, Celeste thought. It never was. It was about being marked. About how certain bodies, certain faces, are made into interruptions. And the thing about these minor slights, these so-called innocent inconsistencies, is that they're cumulative. They wear you down. They rearrange your day, your dignity. She had lived long enough to understand how prejudice evolves, not always in fire, but in the slow freeze of indifference. Halfway through the flight, the pilot announced a brief delay due to air traffic over New York. A groan moved through the cabin. Celeste, who had meetings lined up at JFK with airport safety officers, tapped a reminder into her phone. She would need to reschedule. She also added something else to her notes: flight staff inattentive to exit row briefing. She'd noticed it earlier. The young man in the emergency exit hadn't been briefed. No confirmation. No check. Nothing. And that was not just a misstep. That was a federal violation. Still, she said nothing, for now. As the plane began its slow descent, Celeste reached into her bag to retrieve a small penlight, part of her FAA field kit. She had noticed, in passing, a panel near the galley door that looked slightly unsealed. A barely visible separation, but one worth checking. She shone the light discreetly, just a glance, then jotted a note. The kind of thing that might seem petty until a malfunction makes it a tragedy. Angela spotted the motion and approached. What are you doing? She asked, clipped. Celeste looked up. Just observing. That panel may need a latch adjustment. Could come loose on landing. Angela's voice sharpened. Are you with maintenance? No? Then please refrain from interfering. Celeste closed the penlight, but kept her voice even. Safety is everyone's business. Angela scoffed and returned to the galley. Celeste could hear her muttering again. Something about nosy passengers and people thinking they know everything. This time, Celeste did not let it go. She stood, walked calmly to the galley, and said, low and firm, Miss Angela, I've tried to be respectful. But I have every right to observe a cabin for safety issues. And I have been doing just that long before this flight. Angela's brows lifted, her voice dripping sarcasm. Oh, well, thank you, ma'am. We'll be sure to write your name on the cockpit door next time. Celeste inhaled slowly. You don't need my name, but you will need my title. I'm a senior safety compliance officer with the FAA. Angela blinked. There was a moment, half a breath, where the air seemed to pause. Not because Angela was ashamed, but because she was calculating. Celeste continued. I didn't come here to confront you. I didn't want to be the story. But you've ignored seatbelt rules, skipped emergency row protocol, and made a mockery of a passenger's concern. That's not a bad day. That's a culture. Angela turned red, not from embarrassment, but from the shame of being seen. Ma'am, she said, now dropping the sarcasm, if you had told me earlier. I shouldn't have to, Celeste said. Respect should not depend on rank. It should not be reserved for people you think deserve it. Silence. Just the hum of engines and the faint rattle of overhead bins. Behind her, a few passengers pretended not to be listening. Then, a voice from the back. A man, white-haired, leaning into the aisle. She's right, he said simply. I watched it too. Angela said nothing. Celeste returned to her seat. The plane dipped lower, the city skyline unfolding beneath them like a tired truth. As they prepared for landing, Angela passed through once more, checking belts. She stopped by Celeste and offered a single, brittle word, understood. Not an apology, not even a concession. But in that one word, there was the smallest fracture. A shift, the beginning, perhaps, of a crack in the wall. Celeste didn't need to win. She needed to be heard. And for the first time on that flight, she was. There's a difference between flying and being flown. The one who flies imagines freedom, imagines motion, imagines that the seat beneath them, the sky above, belongs equally to all. But the one being flown, especially if they are black, especially if they are a woman, knows better. They know there are places they can sit but not speak, paths they may walk but not question, and silences that are expected of them, even in turbulence. Celeste Braxton had been quiet long enough. The plane touched down at JFK with a whisper of rubber on asphalt, a smooth landing, though nothing else about the flight had been smooth. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, Celeste could feel the gaze of Angela, the flight attendant, burning through her shoulder blades, part disdain, part calculation. Angela now understood she had misjudged someone. And people like her didn't like being caught in the act of their own smallness. As the seatbelt sign clicked off and passengers stood to retrieve their luggage, Celeste remained seated. She had learned, from years of both flight and life, that rushing out was never worth the bruised elbow or the bruised pride. Besides, she had one more thing to do. Angela made her way down the aisle, performing the ritual goodbyes. Her tone had shifted, more clipped than courteous. When she reached Celeste, she forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Have a pleasant day, she said, low and flat. Celeste met her gaze without flinching. We'll be in touch, she said. Angela blinked once, slow, like someone watching a curtain drop too fast to stop. She knew now. The game had changed. Celeste exited the plane last, her heels clicking against the jet bridge floor. As she entered the terminal, a younger black woman in a TSA uniform approached her hesitantly. Ma'am, she said softly, I was off duty, sitting in row 19. I saw most of it. I just wanted to say, thank you. Not everyone speaks up. Celeste offered a quiet smile. We don't always get the luxury of silence. The woman nodded solemnly, then returned to her post. Outside, the terminal bustled with the usual chaos, families reuniting, children crying, business people tapping furiously on phones. But Celeste walked with the stillness of someone carrying both dignity and weariness. She hailed a cab, gave her destination, FAA regional office on First Avenue, and slid into the back seat. As the taxi pulled off, she leaned her head against the window. She wasn't angry, not exactly. It was deeper than that. It was the exhaustion that comes from knowing too much, from recognizing how a single bad interaction, if left unchecked, can become policy by default. When she reached the office, she bypassed her desk and headed straight for the compliance room, a space lined with soundproof glass, 2 monitors, and a federal-grade filing cabinet where reports from all over the eastern seaboard passed through. She logged into her secure terminal, opened the incident reporting system, and began to type. Air Vista Flight 622, Preliminary Summary. Violation of FAA Passenger Safety Compliance Protocol. Flight attendant failed to brief the emergency row. Ignored seatbelt sign. Repeated microaggressions toward a black female passenger, FAA officer. Dismissed valid safety concerns, resulting in minor injury during turbulence. Flight crew unaware of FAA oversight present on board. No cabin crew escalation observed prior to the injury event. She paused, fingers hovering above the keyboard. What was it Baldwin once said? That the most dangerous creation of any society is the man who has nothing to lose. But what about the woman who's done losing, who's done apologizing for noticing the holes in the system? She added. Suggest immediate review of Air Vista's internal training on diversity, emergency procedure adherence, and chain of command recognition. Passenger dignity is not secondary to protocol, it is part of it. Before submitting, she attached her badge number, travel ID, and time-stamped notes. The report was formal, procedural, and necessary. But the real work, the human work, was just beginning. Later that afternoon, she received a call. Not from the airline. Not from a lawyer. From her niece, Dominique. "Auntie," she said, her voice young but serious, "Mama told me what happened." "Were you scared?" Celeste sat down slowly. The question touched something she hadn't allowed herself to feel until now. "No, baby," she said quietly. "I wasn't scared. I was tired. And when you're tired long enough, you stop asking to be treated right, you demand it." Dominique didn't speak right away. Then she whispered, "I want to be like you when I grow up." Celeste smiled, eyes wet but clear. "You will be. Just make sure you're ready to make people uncomfortable for the right reasons." She hung up, stood, and walked to the window. The city was bathed in late afternoon sun, casting long shadows on the buildings like memories stretching across generations. The story wasn't over. It never was. The next chapter, as always, would be written by those who refuse to forget. The thing about racism in America is that it rarely announces itself with a scream. No, it creeps in with a smile, with policy, with phrases like company protocol and "we're just following procedure." It masks itself behind uniforms and polite indifference, hiding in the spaces between what's said and what's meant. And for folks who've lived long enough, especially those who lived through the sit-ins and the hoses, the marches and the murders, this isn't new. It's familiar. Painfully so. Celeste Braxton knew this game all too well. 2 days after submitting her report, the response came not in the form of an apology, but in the shape of a phone call from Air Vista's legal department. The voice on the other end was tight, clipped, and clearly rehearsed. "Miss Braxton, this is Nathaniel Ames, Corporate Liaison for Air Vista Airlines. We received your report regarding Flight 622. While we acknowledge your position within the FAA, I must inform you that our initial findings indicate no significant breach of protocol by our crew." That was the first blow. Celeste didn't answer immediately. She sat with the weight of those words, letting them settle in her chest. Then she spoke with a calm that cut sharper than any raised voice. "Mr. Ames," she said, "did your initial findings include the seatbelt violations? The unbriefed emergency row? Or perhaps the moment your flight attendant disregarded a federal safety sign in front of multiple passengers?" There was silence, brief, telling. "We're still reviewing all the facts," he replied. "But we also received a complaint about you. That you disrupted service, raised your voice, and caused unnecessary alarm. Our team is considering whether to file a formal response with the FAA." That was the second blow. Now, had she been 20 years younger or fresh out of school with something to prove, Celeste might have let her temper flare. But years of struggle, decades of being the only black woman in rooms full of men with power and pens, had taught her how to make silence do the work. "I understand," she said simply. Then I trust the full FAA investigation will clarify matters. They hung up soon after. But the words stayed with her like a bruise beneath the skin. That night, Celeste couldn't sleep. The lights of Manhattan danced across her apartment walls, but her mind was stuck in a loop, not on the turbulence or the glare of that flight attendant, but on the quiet threat from Mr. Ames. The suggestion that she might be the problem. That familiar twist of narrative so many Black Americans knew too well. If you raise your voice, you're aggressive. If you stay quiet, you're complicit. She picked up her old leather-bound journal, its pages worn from years of scrawl and reflection, and wrote, "They will always try to make you the villain of your own story, especially when your truth costs them something." The next morning, Celeste entered the FAA building with her head held high. There were whispers in the hallways, nothing malicious, but the kind that swirl around anyone who dares to make noise in a system built on silence. Her colleague, Miriam, a white woman, older, kind but cautious, approached her in the elevator. "I read the preliminary findings," she said quietly. "They're downplaying the whole thing. I want you to know I saw your report. And I believe you." Celeste gave her a tired smile. "Thank you. Belief is the beginning. But justice takes more than sympathy." Miriam looked down, ashamed perhaps, or just unsure how to bridge the distance between ally and bystander. Later that day, Celeste was summoned, to a reconciliation meeting between the FAA and AirVista. Not an inquiry. Not a review. A reconciliation. She nearly laughed when she read the invitation. "Reconcile what?" she muttered. "The truth with their comfort?" But she attended because absence speaks as loudly as presence. The conference room was a sterile box of glass and steel. At one end, the FAA panel sat with files and furrowed brows. Across from them, AirVista's legal team, 3 men in dark suits, and a woman Celeste recognized from a past summit, someone who had once complimented her keynote speech, now staring at her like she was a liability. There were pleasantries. There was legalese. Then there was Nathaniel Ames again, now in person, repeating what he had said over the phone, only this time with a condescending warmth meant to seem collegial. "Miss Braxton," he said, "we deeply respect your position and experience. But surely you understand that tensions can rise mid-flight and perceptions can differ. Our employee, Cheyenne Matthews, has reported feeling antagonized, even targeted." That was the third blow. Celeste folded her hands. She looked at each of them, not as enemies, but as reflections of something older, something inherited. This wasn't about one flight attendant. This was about every time a Black voice had been drowned out by procedure, every time a Black body had been asked to move, to wait, to be quiet. "I didn't target her," Celeste said, voice steady. "I observed her. The way I was trained. I watched her ignore safety protocol. I watched her dismiss passengers. And I watched her disregard me, not because I was disruptive, but because I didn't look like someone who should know the rules better than her." Silence. "I filed that report not out of spite, but out of duty. If we're going to talk about reconciliation, then let's reconcile with the truth. That respect should not be contingent on perception, and perception in this country is still poisoned by race." A beat passed. 2 of the panel members shifted in their chairs. Celeste continued. "I don't need apologies. I need accountability. For your staff. For your training. For how you respond when someone who looks like me raises a concern." Nathaniel's lips parted, but no words came. In that moment, perhaps he saw not just a woman with a badge, but a woman with a mirror, reflecting a system that was cracked in the foundation. As the meeting adjourned, Celeste stepped outside and felt the city air hit her like a baptism. Clean, honest, cold. One of the younger panel assistants caught up to her on the steps. "Ms. Braxton," he said nervously, "that was powerful. I think you might have changed a few minds there." She turned, eyes soft but unsparing. "Son, I'm not here to change minds. I'm here to remind them what they already know. Because that's what the elders always did. They didn't wait for the world to be ready. They spoke. They acted. And they carried the scars that built the bridge the next generation would walk across. There are days in this country when being Black feels like living in a house built from paper, inside a world made of brick and steel. Your voice goes through the paper easy enough. It echoes in protest, in policy briefs, in courtroom testimonies, but the walls you speak against? They do not bend. They do not bleed. They do not listen unless the whole house burns. Celeste Braxton, though, was not setting fires. Not yet. After the so-called reconciliation meeting, the temperature around her changed. Not openly. No one slammed doors. No one shouted at her. But the air shifted. Her inbox filled slower. Her calls were returned later. A few colleagues who once leaned in during lunch now offered tight nods from across the hallway. They said it wasn't personal. It never is. At home, she tried to shake it off. She cooked her mother's sweet potato soup. She played Coltrane late into the night, letting his horn cut through the numbness like a sermon. But still, the weight remained. The weight of being the one to speak up. Of being reminded, yet again, that visibility is both a weapon and a target. On Monday, the FAA's internal investigation team sent her a memo. It confirmed what she already knew. Her findings were valid. The violations on board Flight 622 were real and would be documented accordingly. But tucked at the end, in that cold legal tongue beloved by bureaucracies, was a recommendation. The agency advises de-escalation in future field engagements to preserve interorganizational trust. There it was. The fourth blow. Trust. That slippery term, too often reserved for power, never for the people. Celeste stared at the sentence like it had slapped her. De-escalation? She thought. I didn't escalate, I endured. And yet, there it stood. A paper wall. Not strong enough to withstand the storm of truth, but high enough to obscure the face of injustice. That afternoon, she was scheduled to conduct a surprise compliance check at LaGuardia. Nothing fancy, just a standard walkthrough. She wore her FAA blazer. The one with the small silver pin on the lapel. Not because she needed authority, but because she needed to remind them, and perhaps herself, that she belonged in those spaces. As she entered the terminal, she saw the airline staff glance her way. Some stiffened. Others smiled too brightly. The manager on duty, a white man named Douglas, stepped up, clipboard in hand, trying to play both sides of the game. Miss Braxton, he said with polished charm, always a pleasure. Let us know if there's anything we can do. She gave him a firm nod. There is. Follow protocol. He laughed nervously. Of course. Of course. As she walked the concourse, inspecting boarding procedures, she overheard two gate agents whispering behind their counter. She's the one from that Air Vista flight, one said. Yeah. Heard she made a scene. Got someone suspended. Man, they don't forget anything, do they? Celeste didn't flinch. Didn't even turn her head. That was the thing about surviving in a world designed to misunderstand you. You learn how to keep moving with grace, even while bleeding. At Gate 19, she found it. A young Latina flight attendant was rushing through safety checks, obviously under pressure. She skipped the seat belt demonstration entirely, trusting the overhead video to do the job. Celeste gently pulled her aside after boarding. Ma'am, she said, you missed the visual confirmation of passenger compliance. That's a regulation. The attendant's eyes widened. She stammered an apology. I didn't mean to. There were too many delays, and the gate manager said. Celeste raised her hand. Not to scold, but to pause the panic. I'm not here to punish you, she said, softer now. But if we let the cracks form here, they widen in the sky. The woman nodded slowly. Thank you. That was the moment. The rare one. When truth was not deflected or politicized, but received. And still, it wasn't enough to outweigh what would come next. Because not 2 hours later, Celeste received another email, this time from the Director of Stakeholder Relations. Effective immediately, All field personnel are advised to notify airline command centers prior to random compliance audits. This is to ensure transparency and prevent unnecessary disruption. The fifth blow. She read the line 3 times. The translation was clear. No more surprises. No more truth without warning. No more watchdogs, just well-fed pets behind glass doors. Celeste stood from her desk, walked to the window, and looked out over the East River. The city moved below her, taxis, tourists, time, all flowing while the system tried to slow her down. Not stop her. Just enough to exhaust her. To remind her of her place. And yet, she thought of her grandfather, who once told her, "They won't always hang you from a tree, baby girl. Sometimes they just hang onto your credibility." That's what this was. A quiet crucifixion. And she would not be silent about it. That evening, she called a journalist. Not the tabloids, not the sensationalists, but someone she knew from years past, an old-school reporter who still believed in the weight of facts. "I have a story," she said. "And it's not just about one flight attendant. It's about the rules they bend behind closed doors and who pays the price when they do." The reporter paused. "Are you sure you want to go public?" Celeste didn't hesitate. "I've lived too long in a country where silence buys you safety but robs you of self. No more." And with that, she hung up. Because the thing about paper walls? They burn easy. And Celeste Braxton had just struck a match. It is one thing to know the fire exists. It is another to name it, to point and say, that smoke is not confusion, it's consequence. But in this country, when a black woman dares to call the smoke by its name, she doesn't get thanked. She gets questioned. Celeste Braxton was no stranger to that questioning. After her quiet phone call to the reporter, the story spread slowly at first, like a hush slipping under the door. Then it ignited. FAA official alleges pattern of airline negligence and discrimination. Whistleblower speaks out on hidden bias in airline compliance culture. The headlines didn't name Cheyenne Matthews or Flight 622. Celeste had made sure of that. This was never about petty revenge. It was about the architecture of disregard. The casual corrosion of standards, the unspoken codes of behavior enforced not by policy, but by prejudice. But people don't read carefully. Not when race is involved. The backlash came swift. Not from her agency yet, but from the faceless multitude, internet trolls, right-wing pundits, and even well-meaning moderates who preferred the fantasy of colorblind professionalism over the inconvenient truths Celeste insisted on telling. They said she was bitter. They said she was militant. They said she had an axe to grind. And the worst of them said nothing at all. Just watched in silence as the smear campaign grew teeth. At work, the walls narrowed. Her badge still granted her access, but her voice felt heavier. She noticed fewer meetings added to her calendar. A regional supervisor she mentored suddenly stopped responding to emails. Her work, which had once been lifted up as essential oversight, was now being quietly rebranded as disruptive energy. But Celeste kept her head up. Not because she felt no fear, but because fear had never been the thing to stop her. One morning, she was summoned to a closed-door meeting with 2 FAA executives, both white, both with that polished chill of men who'd never had to defend their right to be in the room. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't threaten. They just suggested. "You've brought up valid points," one said. But perhaps the way this was handled, through the media, it's inflaming tensions. "We're asking for collaboration, not confrontation," the other added with a patronizing smile. Celeste blinked. "I followed every internal channel first. I was ignored." "Yes," the first man nodded. "But the public platform, it changes the tone, don't you think?" There it was. The sixth blow. They didn't dispute the truth. They just didn't like its volume. Celeste stood. Not abruptly, not defiantly, but with the grace of someone who refused to shrink. "If your comfort is more important than safety," she said, "then the problem isn't me." Neither man responded. Not really. One just cleared his throat and offered a cold, Bureaucratic promise. We'll take it under review. Outside the room, she leaned against the hallway wall and let out a slow breath. She was tired. Not the kind of tired sleep can cure, but the soul weight of generations. She thought of her grandmother, who cleaned office floors downtown and was called Girl until her hair turned silver. Of her father, who wore a mechanic's uniform and never once saw a manager who looked like him. Of the long line of black bodies taught to whisper even when screaming was the only sane response. That night, she spoke at a community forum. The audience was mostly black elders, retired professionals, and church-going souls who'd lived long enough to know the cycles of this country's memory lapses. I was taught, she said slowly, that professionalism meant not showing emotion. That advocacy should be polite. But I've learned that when a black woman names injustice, especially in a language as precise as policy, she becomes the problem. Not the violations she reports. Not the dangers she highlights. But her. An old man in the front row raised a hand. His skin is like carved mahogany, his voice is gravel and fire. Sister, he said, they've been trying to make our dignity look like defiance since the slave ships. Keep going. And she did. The following week, the FAA launched an internal review of not just Flight 622, but other complaints submitted by employees of color. Quiet cases. Forgotten names. But now they were being pulled back into the light. Celeste was asked to assist. And though she knew it would come with more enemies than allies, she accepted. Because if you're going to name the fire, you might as well be ready to walk through it. There comes a time in every life, especially a black life in America, when you must decide whether your silence is a survival strategy or a betrayal. And once that decision is made, you cannot unmake it. The only way out is forward. Celeste Braxton had chosen her path. And now, the reckoning would follow. Weeks passed. Meetings came and went. The internal FAA review expanded. Stories began surfacing from corners of the system that had long been sealed shut. Flight attendants of color quietly submitting testimony, junior inspectors recounting moments when their reports were ignored if they bore too many concerns, and passengers, always the passengers, writing in with stories that mirrored Celeste's flight. One woman wrote, "My daughter was 5. We were traveling home from my mother's funeral. I asked for water. The flight attendant rolled her eyes and said, 'This isn't room service.' I stayed quiet. But I never forgot." A man wrote, "I saw them skip the safety briefing for the whole row, mine. All black. Then they asked us not to loiter near the bathroom. We were in the exit row. We were waiting for our turn." The stories poured in like rainfall, gentle and furious, undeniable. But none of that prepared Celeste for the letter that arrived in a beige envelope, plain as dust. It was from Cheyenne Matthews. Not an email. A handwritten letter. The slanted script of someone trying not to shake. "Miss Braxton. I don't know how to begin, except to say I've been humbled. I was suspended, then required to repeat my safety training from scratch. The instructor said something I didn't expect. He said, 'You know, the way you treated that woman on Flight 622, she could have saved your life.' I didn't understand it at first. I do now. I didn't see you. I saw a problem where there wasn't one. I saw defiance when there was only concern. I saw color when I should have seen a character. I'm not proud of that. I don't know if I deserve forgiveness. But I'm working on being someone who could. Respectfully. Cheyenne." Celeste sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. Not in triumph. Not in pity. But in something quieter, something heavier. Recognition, perhaps. The kind that crosses class, skin, uniform. The knowledge that racism isn't just the barked slur or the slammed door. It's the absence of seeing. The refusal to witness another's dignity until forced by consequence. That same week, Celeste was asked to speak at a congressional subcommittee hearing on transportation equity. The invitation was formal, but the reason was clear. Her voice had broken the silence. Now the country wanted to know what she'd seen behind that curtain. She stood at the long mahogany table in a room lined with men in suits, a few women and fewer still who looked like her. Cameras rolled. Pens scratched paper. But she didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She spoke plainly. America built its aviation industry on the dream of freedom, the right to move, to rise. But that dream was never neutral. The runway might be long, but not all of us take off from the same gate. And when a Black woman raises a concern, she shouldn't be met with condescension. She should be met with care. Because if safety isn't for all of us, then it's not safety at all. Some nodded. A few looked away. One man, an older congressman from the South, leaned forward and said, "Miss Braxton, with all due respect, don't you think you're making too much of one bad flight?" She smiled then. Not cruelly. Just with the weary grace of someone who's heard that line since she was old enough to speak. "One flight," she repeated. "Sir, I've been flying my whole life." The transcript of her testimony was published in full. The FAA adopted 2 new policies within months: mandatory racial bias training for all commercial flight staff, and a new hotline allowing FAA staff and passengers to report discriminatory conduct anonymously, with oversight from a civil rights advisory board. It was not a revolution, but it was real. Celeste didn't celebrate publicly. She wasn't built for spectacle. But in the quiet of her home, beneath a framed photo of her mother holding a paper plane, a relic from the Tuskegee Airmen Museum, Celeste poured herself a glass of water and sat still. Outside, a plane soared through the night sky, a blinking red light against the velvet dark. She watched it until it disappeared. And in that moment, she felt something settle. Not victory, not absolution, but clarity. The sky, after all, belongs to no one. But what we put into it, the fear, the grace, the cruelty, the courage, determines how safe it feels for the next soul who climbs aboard. And Celeste Braxton had made it safer. Not by shouting, but by standing and refusing to sit back down.